The night of August 6, 1943, Vella Gulf, Solomon Islands. Captain Kaju Sugiura stood on the bridge of his destroyer Hagikaze, watching the dark waters ahead through the humid tropical darkness. Behind him, 3 more destroyers carried 900 Japanese soldiers packed onto their decks, reinforcements desperately needed for the Vila garrison on Kolombangara. The mission was routine. They had run this exact route twice before without incident. The Americans, Sugiura had been assured, would be patrolling Kula Gulf to the south, far from Vella Gulf. His ships moved through the darkness, confident, invisible, protected by the night that had been Japan's greatest tactical advantage for 2 years of Pacific warfare. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 10 miles to the south, Commander Frederick Moosbrugger's 6 American destroyers were tracking Sugiura's force on radar. The green circular display showed 4 distinct contacts moving west through Vella Gulf at 24 knots, range 22,000 yards, and closing. The Japanese had no idea they were being watched. They couldn't see the Americans in the darkness. They didn't know American destroyers now carried equipment that could track ships beyond visual range and guide weapons with deadly precision. The technological revolution that would end Japanese naval dominance in night combat was about to demonstrate its power in the most decisive way possible. For 20 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had owned the night. Their destroyer crews were the best-trained night fighters in the world, products of a doctrine refined over 2 decades of intensive preparation. Japanese destroyermen practiced navigation without lights until they could identify islands by silhouette in near-total darkness. Their lookouts trained for years to detect ship wakes and gun flashes at impossible ranges. Their optical equipment, particularly their binoculars and rangefinders, were superior to anything the American or British navies possessed. Most importantly, their tactics emphasized aggressive action in darkness, using speed and surprise to overwhelm enemies before they could react. This superiority had produced devastating results. In August of 1942, at the Battle of Savo Island, Japanese cruisers surprised an Allied force protecting the Guadalcanal landings and sank 4 heavy cruisers in 32 minutes. American ships had early radar systems, but commanders didn't trust the technology. By the time lookouts made visual identification, Japanese long-lance torpedoes were already running toward their targets. The Americans lost over 1,000 sailors that night, teaching them a brutal lesson about the price of fighting the Japanese Navy in darkness. The pattern repeated through late 1942 and into 1943. At Cape Esperance, in October of 1942, American forces achieved surprise using radar, but then lost control when their formation maneuvered into confusion. Ships fired at contacts without knowing if they were friendly or enemy. At the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November, cruisers and destroyers engaged Japanese battleships at ranges under 3,000 yards. Ships fired at muzzle flashes in pitch-black conditions. The Americans stopped the Japanese bombardment, but lost 4 destroyers, 2 light cruisers, and 2 admirals killed in action. Japanese confidence in their night-fighting supremacy rested on more than training and experience. It reflected a fundamental assumption about naval warfare that had guided their doctrine since the 1920s. Darkness neutralized American advantages in firepower and industrial strength. In daylight, American ships could bring their superior numbers and production capacity to bear. But at night, when visibility dropped to under 1 mile and optical instruments became useless, the playing field leveled. Japanese crews who had trained for years in low-light conditions could exploit confusion and limited visibility to achieve tactical surprise against numerically superior forces. The weapons that enabled this doctrine were themselves products of Japanese technological excellence. The Type 93 torpedo, called Long Lance by the Americans, was the best torpedo in any navy's inventory. 24 feet long and weighing 2 tons, it carried a 1,000-pound warhead and ran at 48 knots with a range of 20 miles. American torpedoes typically ran at 45 knots with a range of 6,000 yards. The Long Lance could hit from 3 times farther away at higher speed, and it was powered by oxygen-enriched kerosene, which produced no visible wake. American torpedoes left white trails of bubbles that could be seen for miles. The long lance was nearly invisible, a phantom weapon that struck without warning. This combination of superior training, excellent optical equipment, aggressive tactics, and the world's best torpedo had made Japanese destroyers the most feared surface combatants in the Pacific. By mid-1943, they had earned a reputation for invincibility in night action. American sailors who survived encounters with Japanese destroyers after dark described the experience as fighting ghosts. The enemy would appear without warning, launch devastating torpedo attacks, then disappear back into darkness before American ships could respond effectively. But technology was about to betray Japanese confidence in a way their naval planners had never anticipated. While Japanese destroyermen perfected tactics for fighting blind, American scientists and engineers were developing systems that turned darkness into daylight for those who possessed them. The transformation wasn't visible to Japanese lookouts straining to see through the tropical night. It existed as electromagnetic pulses scanning the ocean's surface, invisible radio waves that reflected off steel hulls and returned data measured in thousandths of a second. The war was changing from visual range combat to electronic warfare, and the Japanese were entering battles without knowing the fundamental rules had been rewritten. The technology that would revolutionize naval combat had remarkable origins. Radar development accelerated dramatically when Britain shared the cavity magnetron with the United States in September of 1940. This device could generate microwave-frequency radio waves at power levels useful for detection and tracking. British scientists had invented it at Birmingham University, but lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce the systems their navy desperately needed. In exchange for American manufacturing capability, they gave the technology away freely, recognizing that Britain's survival depended on both nations possessing the best possible detection systems. The radiation laboratory at Massachusetts Institute of Technology received the magnetron in November of 1940 and within months developed the first microwave radar prototypes. The SG surface search radar emerged from this work, operating at 3,000 MHz using a 10-centimeter wavelength. This was revolutionary. Earlier radars used wavelengths measured in meters. The shorter wavelength of the SG provided dramatically better resolution. Contacts appeared as distinct points rather than fuzzy blobs on the display screen. The SG had another innovation that transformed how operators could use radar data. The plan position indicator display was a circular screen showing a map-like view of the tactical situation. The American ship appeared at the center as a bright dot. North was at the top. Contacts appeared as bright points of light at their actual bearing and range relative to the operator's ship. The display updated continuously as the antenna rotated at 15 revolutions per minute. An operator could see the entire tactical situation at a glance. Formation positions were obvious. Contact courses could be determined by watching how the points moved. It was intuitive and required less training than earlier oscilloscope displays that showed returns as spikes on a horizontal line. USS Augusta received the first operational SG radar in April of 1942. By November of 1942, fewer than 50 American warships had SG radar. It was still cutting-edge technology that many officers viewed skeptically. The equipment was complex and could malfunction. Vacuum tubes failed regularly and had to be replaced. The antenna motors sometimes jammed. Officers who had served their entire careers without radar weren't convinced it was worth depending on for survival in combat. But a small number of forward-thinking commanders recognized what radar could accomplish. Admiral Willis Lee used radar to devastating effect at the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November of 1942, when USS Washington tracked and destroyed the Japanese battleship Kirishima in a 7-minute engagement fought entirely by electronics. That battle proved radar could dominate surface combat, but the lesson took time to spread through the Navy. Traditional doctrine said radar was a backup to visual systems. Most commanders still thought of night combat in terms of optical range-finding and visual spotting, not electronic tracking and calculated fire. The Japanese faced an even more fundamental problem than American skepticism about radar. They were years behind in developing the technology themselves. Japanese radar programs existed, but they received inadequate funding and support from naval leadership. The first radar sets were installed in Japanese destroyers in March of 1942, initially in newly commissioned ships of the Yagumo class. But these systems were primitive compared to American equipment. The Type 21 air search radar, introduced in 1942, was effective only to 100 kilometers and couldn't provide the precision needed for fire control. The Type 22 surface search radar, introduced in August of 1943, had a maximum range of 35 kilometers against ships, roughly half the effective range of the American SG radar. More critically, Japanese radar production remained limited throughout the war. Even by late 1943, when American ships were being fitted with radar as standard equipment, most Japanese destroyers had no radar at all. The few that received equipment got sets that were less capable, less reliable, and less well integrated into fire control systems than their American equivalents. Japanese lookouts remained the primary detection method for most destroyers throughout 1943, limiting their effectiveness to visual range in darkness. This technological gap created a fundamental asymmetry that Japanese commanders didn't fully appreciate. When American and Japanese destroyer forces encountered each other at night, the Americans could see 20 to 30 miles in darkness, while the Japanese could see less than 1 mile. The Americans could track multiple contacts simultaneously and calculate firing solutions based on precise range and bearing data. The Japanese had to rely on visual spotting, optical rangefinders that were nearly useless without light, and estimates based on experience and intuition. It was equivalent to fighting with one side possessing night vision equipment, while the other side operated completely blind. The implications of this asymmetry wouldn't become clear until August of 1943, when the two tactical philosophies collided in Vella Gulf. Japanese destroyer doctrine, refined over decades and proven in 2 years of combat, would confront American electronic warfare capability that had barely existed 18 months earlier. The outcome would shock Japanese naval commanders and force them to reconsider fundamental assumptions about night combat that had guided their strategy since the 1920s. Captain Sugiura's confidence as he led his 4 destroyers through Vella Gulf reflected the accumulated wisdom of Japanese destroyer doctrine. He commanded experienced ships with veteran crews. His destroyers carried the world's best torpedoes. His lookouts had trained for years in night operations. The mission plan followed established procedures that had worked successfully in previous runs. Everything suggested routine execution of a standard resupply mission, the kind of operation Japanese destroyers had performed dozens of times throughout the Solomons campaign. What Sugiura couldn't know was that Commander Moosbrugger's American destroyers were tracking his every move on radar from beyond visual range. The Americans knew exactly where the Japanese ships were, what course they were steering, and what speed they were making. Moosbrugger's radar operators had detected the Japanese force at 23:33 hours, 10 miles to their north. The contacts appeared clearly on the SG radar displays, 4 distinct returns moving west through Vella Gulf toward Blackett Strait. The Americans closed silently. Their positions revealed only by electromagnetic emissions the Japanese had no equipment to detect. The technological advantage manifesting in Moosbrugger's Combat Information Center represented more than superior equipment. It embodied a complete transformation in how naval battles could be fought. For centuries, naval commanders had operated by looking at the enemy and making decisions based on visual information. They could see the enemy formation. They could see where shells were landing. They could see damage on enemy ships. The development of radar changed everything. Commanders would now sit inside ships and make decisions based on electronic displays showing dots and numbers. They would order attacks against targets nobody could see, using data from electronics that most officers barely understood. The clash between these two approaches, between traditional visual combat and electronic warfare, was about to demonstrate which philosophy would dominate naval warfare for decades to come. Japanese confidence, built on 2 decades of training and 2 years of victories in night combat, would collide with American technological capability that existed as invisible radio waves scanning the darkness. The night of August 6, 1943, would mark the beginning of the end for Japanese destroyer supremacy in the Pacific War. Commander Moosbrugger studied the radar plot display with practiced calm. His 6 destroyers had divided into 2 divisions for the attack. Division A, 1, consisting of USS Dunlap, USS Craven, and USS Maury, would fire torpedoes first. Division A, 2, with USS Lang, USS Sterett, and USS Stack, would follow up with gun and torpedo fire to complete the destruction. The plan was simple and had been rehearsed extensively. Use radar to achieve perfect positioning, close to torpedo, range undetected, fire a coordinated salvo, turn away before the Japanese could respond. Let the electronics do what human eyes couldn't accomplish in darkness. At 23:41 hours, Moosbrugger ordered Division A-1 to fire. 24 Mark 15 torpedoes entered the water in the span of 63 seconds. The weapons accelerated to 46 knots and began their run toward the Japanese formation. The Americans had finally addressed the technical problems that plagued their torpedoes since Pearl Harbor. The magnetic exploders that had caused premature detonations or duds throughout 1942 and early 1943 had been fixed. The depth-keeping mechanisms that caused torpedoes to run too deep had been corrected. American torpedoes now worked as designed, and they were about to prove it against targets that had no idea they were under attack. Captain Sugiura's lookouts on Hagikaze spotted the incoming torpedoes 30 seconds before impact. 30 seconds. That's how long the Japanese had to react to an attack they never saw coming. There was no time to maneuver, no time to launch counterattacks, no time to warn the other ships in any coordinated way. The torpedoes simply appeared as white wakes streaking through the dark water, phosphorescent trails marking the final seconds before detonation. Multiple torpedoes slammed into Hagikaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze almost simultaneously at 23:43 hours. The explosions were catastrophic. Hagikaze, carrying Captain Sugiura and 300 Japanese soldiers, took hits in her fire rooms. High-pressure steam lines ruptured. Superheated steam at 600 degrees filled compartments, killing everyone inside instantly. The ship's power failed. Her engines stopped. She began settling immediately as water poured through torn hull plates. Arashi suffered similar damage. Torpedoes struck amidships, breaking her keel and flooding her machinery spaces. The destroyer's back was literally broken. She began breaking apart even before fires from ruptured fuel lines spread through her superstructure. Japanese soldiers packed on her decks were thrown into the water by the explosions. Many were killed by the blast effects. Others went into the dark ocean wearing life jackets, their screams lost in the chaos of exploding ships and burning fuel oil spreading across the water. Kawakaze's fate was sealed by a torpedo that hit one of her magazines. The explosion was devastating, far larger than the torpedo warhead alone could produce. The magazine contained several tons of ammunition for the 5-inch guns and smaller weapons. When the torpedo's warhead detonated against the magazine's exterior, it triggered a sympathetic detonation of everything inside. The entire forward section of the ship, from the bow to the bridge, disintegrated in a massive fireball. The blast killed everyone forward instantly. Kawakaze rolled over and sank within minutes, taking most of her crew and the 200 soldiers she carried down with her. Only Shigure, the 4th destroyer, escaped immediate destruction. A torpedo struck her stern, but failed to detonate. The weapon was a dud, one of the few remaining defective torpedoes in the American inventory. It passed through Shigure's rudder, damaging the steering mechanism, but not causing catastrophic damage. Captain Tamechi Hara, commanding Shigure, immediately ordered emergency turns and began launching his own torpedoes toward where he estimated the American ships must be positioned based on the torpedo wakes. Shigure fired 8 long-lance torpedoes at 23:45 hours, weapons that under normal circumstances would have devastated any force caught within their range. But the Americans had already turned away at high speed after launching their attack. Moosbrugger's plan called for firing torpedoes, then immediately withdrawing to avoid counterattacks. The Japanese torpedoes ran through empty ocean, missing their targets by hundreds of yards. The Americans were no longer where Hara thought they should be. Division A-2 now opened fire with their 5-inch guns and launched additional torpedoes at the burning Japanese ships. Lang, Sterett, and Stack targeted Hagikaze and Arashi with gunfire that was visible for miles, orange tracers arcing through the darkness to strike ships that were already dying. The Americans were operating on doctrine developed specifically for this type of engagement. Don't give away your position with gunfire until your torpedoes start detonating. Use the explosions and fires to illuminate targets for your guns. Destroy the enemy before they can organize effective resistance. The engagement was effectively over by midnight on August 7th. Hagikaze and Arashi, both ablaze and dead in the water, continued burning until their magazines exploded around 12:30 hours. The detonations were massive, sending flames hundreds of feet into the air and scattering debris across the Gulf. Kawakaze had already sunk. Sugiura escaped into the darkness, damaged but functional, racing north toward Rabaul with the news of complete disaster. The Battle of Vella Gulf lasted approximately 17 minutes from first torpedo launch to the sinking of the last Japanese destroyer. In that time, the Americans sank 3 destroyers and killed over 1,200 Japanese soldiers and sailors. The American destroyers suffered no damage. Not a single shell hit any of Musbrugger's ships. Not one American sailor was killed or wounded. The victory was so complete, so one-sided, that it shocked even the Americans who had executed it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The significance of Vella Gulf extended far beyond the tactical outcome. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese destroyers had been beaten decisively in a night action by American destroyers operating independently without cruiser support. More importantly, the battle demonstrated that radar had fundamentally changed the nature of night combat. The Japanese hadn't even known American ships were present until torpedoes started exploding against their hulls. They never achieved tactical surprise. They never launched a coordinated torpedo attack. They never exploited their superior training in night operations. Radar had neutralized every advantage the Japanese had spent 20 years developing. Captain Hara's report to his superiors in Rabaul painted a devastating picture of Japanese vulnerability in the new electronic warfare environment. His ships had been ambushed by an enemy they couldn't detect. The Americans had achieved perfect tactical positioning without being seen. They had fired weapons from beyond visual range with accuracy that suggested they knew exactly where the Japanese ships were at all times. The implications were clear and terrifying. If American destroyers possessed equipment that could track ships in complete darkness, then Japanese night fighting doctrine had become obsolete overnight. Japanese naval intelligence began analyzing captured equipment and interrogating prisoners to understand the technology that had destroyed 3 destroyers in Vella Gulf. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. The Americans had developed radar systems that were years ahead of Japanese equivalents in range, accuracy, and reliability. The SG surface search radar could detect destroyer-sized targets at 18,000 yards or more in good conditions. Japanese destroyers without radar couldn't see American ships until they were within 1,000 yards visually. The Americans could track Japanese formations for 20 minutes or more before the Japanese even knew they were being observed. The psychological impact on Japanese destroyer crews was immediate and profound. For 2 years, they had owned the night. Their training, equipment, and tactics had produced victory after victory in darkness. Now they were losing battles before they could even engage. Ships were being sunk by enemies they never saw. Torpedoes were arriving without warning from directions the Japanese couldn't predict. The confidence built through decades of training and 2 years of combat success evaporated as crews realized they were fighting blind against opponents who could see everything. The disaster at Vella Gulf forced Japanese naval commanders to reconsider their entire approach to night operations. Within a week, they concluded that Kolombangara couldn't be held and began planning to evacuate the garrison they had built up at such cost. The Tokyo Express runs that had sustained Japanese positions throughout the Solomons became increasingly dangerous as American radar-equipped destroyers hunted them with impunity. Japanese destroyer strength, already eroded by months of constant operations, began declining more rapidly as losses mounted in engagements where American technological superiority proved decisive. But the transformation in night combat capabilities didn't end with Vella Gulf. Throughout late 1943, American destroyer tactics continued evolving to exploit radar advantages more effectively. Commander Arleigh Burke, who would become one of the Pacific War's most successful destroyer commanders, studied the Vella Gulf engagement extensively. He recognized that radar allowed destroyers to function as independent offensive weapons rather than defensive screens for cruisers and battleships. Burke developed doctrine emphasizing aggressive action, radar-guided torpedo attacks, and tight formations that minimized the risk of fratricide while maximizing coordinated striking power. Burke's opportunity to prove his theories came on the night of November 25, 1943, at Cape Street, George. Intelligence reports indicated Japanese destroyers were running reinforcements to Buka Island at the northern end of the Solomons. 5 destroyers under Captain Kyoto Kagawa would carry 920 troops from Rabaul to Buka, then withdraw with 700 naval personnel being evacuated from the damaged airfield. Burke's Destroyer Squadron, 23, consisting of 5 Fletcher-class destroyers, received orders to intercept them. Burke's force departed Purvis Bay at 1900 hours on November 24, steaming northward at 27 knots. The destroyers maintained strict radio silence, while their radar operators scanned continuously for contacts. Burke positioned his ships along a patrol line, calculated to intercept the Japanese on their return journey from Buka. The plan was similar to Moosbrugger's approach at Vella Gulf. Use radar to achieve perfect positioning. Close undetected. Launch a coordinated torpedo attack. Complete the destruction with gunfire if necessary. At 0141 hours on November 25, Burke's destroyers detected the Japanese force on radar at 22,000 yards. The contacts were clear and distinct on the SG displays. 2 escort destroyers, Onami and Makinami, screened ahead of 3 transport destroyers, Amagiri, Uzuki, and Yugiri. The Japanese were steaming west toward Cape Street, George, heading home to Rabaul after successfully landing their troops and evacuating the naval personnel from Buka. Captain Kagawa's lookouts saw nothing. The night was dark with no moon. Low clouds blocked starlight. Visibility was less than 1 mile. The Japanese destroyers maintained their course at 24 knots. Their crews relaxed after completing another successful mission. They had evaded American PT boats earlier in the evening. The patrol aircraft that sometimes hunted them hadn't appeared. The dangerous part of the mission seemed over. They were heading home. Burke maneuvered his destroyers to optimize firing position while remaining undetected. At 0156 hours, his 3 lead destroyers, USS Charles Osborne, USS Claxton, and USS Dyson, fired 15 Mark 15 torpedoes toward the Japanese escort destroyers. The weapons entered the water and accelerated to attack speed, their wakes invisible in the darkness. Burke's ships immediately turned south to avoid any Japanese counterattacks, while his 2nd Division, USS Converse and USS Spence, prepared to engage with guns and torpedoes. The Japanese detected nothing until 30 seconds before impact. Lookouts on Onami spotted white wakes approaching through the darkness at 0159 hours. There was no time to maneuver or warn the other ships effectively. The torpedoes simply arrived, multiple weapons, striking both escort destroyers almost simultaneously. Onami, Kagawa's flagship, took several torpedo hits amidships. The explosions broke her keel and flooded her machinery spaces. She rolled over and sank at 0200 hours, less than 1 minute after the torpedoes struck. Captain Kagawa went down with his ship along with 228 crew members. There were no survivors. The destroyer simply vanished beneath the dark waters of the Pacific, taking with her every man aboard. Makinami suffered similar damage. Torpedoes struck her fire rooms and engine spaces, flooding critical compartments and destroying her propulsion machinery. She lost power and began settling rapidly. Her crew attempted to contain the flooding, but the damage was catastrophic. Burke's 2nd Division, Converse and Spence, finished her with additional torpedoes and 5-inch gunfire. Makinami sank at 0230 hours with 200 men killed. Only 28 survived the sinking. The 3 transport destroyers turned north and fled at maximum speed when they saw their escorts explode. Captain Yamashiro, commanding the transport force, recognized immediately that they were under attack by a superior force, using tactics the Japanese couldn't counter. His ships were heavily laden with evacuated personnel, reducing their speed and maneuverability. Running was their only option against an enemy they couldn't see. Burke's three lead destroyers pursued at 31 knots, steadily closing the range while tracking the fleeing Japanese ships on radar. The Americans opened fire with their 5-inch guns around 02:22 hours, scoring hits on all three transport destroyers. Shell splashes walked up to the Japanese ships as American gun directors calculated firing solutions based entirely on radar data. The Japanese crews could see muzzle flashes in the darkness behind them, but they couldn't determine range or bearing accurately enough to return effective fire. Uzuki was hit by one shell that failed to detonate, a dud that punched through her superstructure without exploding. She escaped with light damage. Amagiri, the same, destroyer that had rammed and sunk PT-109 commanded by Lieutenant John F. Kennedy 3 months earlier, escaped completely untouched through a combination of aggressive maneuvering and good fortune. But Yugiri, the third transport destroyer, became Burke's primary target when the Japanese ships split up and fled in different directions around 02:25 hours. Burke chose to concentrate his entire force on Yugiri, rather than dividing to pursue multiple targets. His 3 destroyers tracked her on radar through constant turns and speed changes. Yugiri's captain fought desperately to escape, using every evasion technique Japanese destroyer doctrine taught. He made radical course changes. He varied speed constantly. He launched torpedoes toward the pursuing Americans. Nothing worked. The American radar tracked every movement. The SG displays showed Yugiri's position, updating every few seconds as the antenna rotated. The pursuit continued for over an hour. Burke's destroyers fired repeatedly at Yugiri, walking shells closer with each salvo despite the target's evasive maneuvering. Around 03:28 hours, repeated hits set fires throughout Yugiri's superstructure and caused flooding that couldn't be controlled. The destroyer slowed and began listing. Her crew abandoned ship as flames spread. Yugiri capsized and sank with 141 men killed. 279 survivors went into the water, where they were later rescued by Japanese submarines I-177 and I-181. The Battle of Cape Street. George lasted approximately 2 hours from first torpedo launch to the sinking of Yugiri. Burke's destroyers sank 3 Japanese destroyers and damaged a 4th while suffering no damage and no casualties themselves. It was, in the assessment of the Naval War College president, an almost perfect action. The victory demonstrated that American destroyer tactics had evolved to fully exploit radar advantages. Japanese destroyers, fighting without equivalent technology, couldn't compete. The pattern established at Vella Gulf and confirmed at Cape Street, George would repeat throughout the remaining months of 1943 and into 1944. American destroyers, equipped with radar, consistently defeated Japanese destroyers that lacked comparable equipment. At Empress Augusta Bay in November of 1943, American cruisers and destroyers used radar to defeat a Japanese force attempting to attack the Bougainville landings. In each engagement, the Americans detected Japanese ships first, achieved tactical positioning before the Japanese knew they were present, and launched attacks that caught the enemy by surprise. Japanese attempts to adapt to the new reality proved inadequate. They couldn't develop and deploy radar systems quickly enough to close the technological gap. Even when Japanese ships received radar equipment, the systems were less capable and less reliable than American equivalents. Japanese destroyers fought increasingly desperately throughout late 1943, knowing they were entering battles at a fundamental disadvantage they couldn't overcome through training or tactics. The psychological transformation within the Japanese destroyer force was devastating. Captains who had been aggressive became cautious. Units that had pressed attacks began withdrawing when radar-equipped American ships appeared. The confidence built over 20 years of training and 2 years of combat victories evaporated. Japanese destroyermen realized they were fighting an enemy using technology they couldn't detect and couldn't counter. Battles were being lost before the Japanese could even engage effectively. Captain Hara, one of the few Japanese destroyer commanders to survive multiple encounters with radar-equipped American forces, wrote extensively about the psychological impact after the war. He described the terror of fighting an invisible enemy, of watching ships sink around him without ever seeing the American vessels that destroyed them. He detailed the helplessness Japanese lookouts felt when torpedoes arrived without warning from directions they hadn't been watching. The technology gap had created a battlefield where one side could see everything while the other side operated completely blind. The morning of November 26, 1943, brought a quiet that felt unnatural to Burke's destroyer crews. They had spent the night pursuing and destroying Japanese ships with methodical efficiency. Now they were steaming south toward friendly waters, waiting for the inevitable Japanese air attack from the nearby Rabaul airfields. 4 bases within striking distance held hundreds of fighters and bombers. The weather was clear. American ships were deep in enemy-controlled waters, far beyond their own air cover. Every sailor aboard Burke's destroyers expected retaliation to come screaming out of the tropical sky at any moment. Nothing happened. The Japanese didn't strike back. Burke's destroyers continued sailing into friendlier waters, and still no aircraft appeared. The silence was more unnerving than combat would have been. Finally, identical requests began coming to Burke's flagship from every destroyer in the formation. The messages were simple but profound. Please arrange Thanksgiving services for all hands on arrival. The crews wanted to give thanks to God for their victory and their deliverance. They understood how close they had come to disaster, how fortunate they were to have survived without a single casualty, despite operating deep in enemy territory. The absence of Japanese air attacks reflected more than luck. It revealed the broader strategic exhaustion that was overtaking Japanese forces throughout the Solomons. The destroyer losses at Vella Gulf and Cape Street, George, were part of a larger pattern of attrition that was grinding down Japanese military capability faster than replacement could occur. Japan had started the war with 129 destroyers. By late 1943, they had lost over 50 destroyers to all causes. Combat and operational losses combined. The construction rate couldn't keep pace with the losses. More critically, they couldn't replace the experienced crews who went down with their ships. The final Tokyo Express run occurred on November 26, 1943, the same day Burke's destroyers retired from Cape Street George. 6 Japanese destroyers successfully delivered reinforcements to Buka Island, but were intercepted on their return to Rabaul by 5 American destroyers. Exploiting their superior radar, the Americans made a coordinated torpedo attack before being detected. 3 Japanese destroyers, Onami, Makinami, and Yugiri, were sunk with no losses to the Americans. It was the mirror image of Cape Street George, confirmation that Japanese destroyers could no longer operate safely in waters where American radar-equipped ships were hunting them. After that night, the Tokyo Express ceased operations. The fast destroyer transport runs that had sustained Japanese garrisons throughout the Solomons for over a year were finished. The combination of American air power during daylight and radar-equipped surface ships at night made the runs too costly to sustain. Japanese forces on isolated islands were cut off, left to fight with whatever supplies they had accumulated. The strategic initiative in the Solomons passed completely to American hands. The broader implications of radar superiority extended beyond the Solomons campaign. Throughout 1944, American surface forces dominated night engagements across the Pacific. At the Battle of Surigao Strait in October of 1944, American battleships and destroyers used radar to ambush a Japanese force attempting to attack the Leyte Gulf landings. The Americans crossed the Japanese T formation, achieving perfect tactical positioning through radar tracking alone. They destroyed 2 battleships and 3 destroyers while suffering minimal damage. It was the last battleship engagement in history, fought primarily by electronics rather than visual spotting. Japanese naval leadership struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their technological disadvantage. Intelligence officers examined captured American radar equipment and interrogated prisoners, but understanding the principles didn't help them close the capability gap. Japan's industrial base couldn't produce radar systems in the quantities needed, and even when systems were produced, they remained inferior in range, accuracy, and reliability compared to American equipment. The Type 22 radar, which became the most widely installed Japanese naval set by late 1943, had an effective range of 35 kilometers against ships and 35 kilometers against aircraft at low altitude. The American SG radar could detect ships at over 40 kilometers and had far better, discrimination between contacts. More importantly, American radar production ramped up dramatically throughout 1943 and 1944. By the end of the war, virtually every American warship had multiple radar systems. Most Japanese ships never received radar at all. The tactical advantage this created was insurmountable through training or courage alone. Japanese destroyer crews remained highly skilled and motivated throughout the war. Their torpedoes were still superior to American weapons. Their tactical doctrine remained sound in theory. But none of that mattered when they couldn't see the enemy until torpedoes were already striking their hulls. The fundamental problem was that radar had changed the nature of naval warfare more profoundly than any single technology since the introduction of steam power. For centuries, naval battles had been visual affairs. Admirals positioned their fleets where they could see the enemy. Gun crews aimed at targets they could observe through telescopes. Ship captains maneuvered based on what they saw happening around them. Radar eliminated the requirement for visual contact. Ships could now fight at ranges where neither side could see the other with human eyes. Victory went to whichever force had better information about enemy positions, courses, and speeds. Electronics replaced eyesight as the primary sensor for naval combat. The Japanese faced an additional challenge beyond technological inferiority. Their entire naval culture emphasized visual skills and optical precision. Officers were trained to identify ships by silhouette. Lookouts practiced detecting contacts at extreme ranges using binoculars. Rangefinder operators refined their ability to measure distances by comparing optical images. These skills had taken years to develop and had proven their value in countless engagements. Radar threatened to make them obsolete, and many Japanese naval officers resisted accepting that reality. Senior Japanese commanders, particularly those who had built their careers on mastering traditional methods, struggled to adapt to electronic warfare. They understood that American ships had equipment that could detect targets beyond visual range, but they continued planning operations as if superior training and aggressive tactics could overcome technological disadvantage. The results were consistently disastrous. Destroyer forces that should have been preserved for decisive battles were ground down in small engagements where American radar superiority proved decisive. By mid-1944, Japanese destroyer strength had declined to the point where they couldn't effectively support major fleet operations. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, Japanese destroyers performed screening duties but contributed little to the engagement's outcome. At the Battle of Vella Gulf in October, Japanese destroyers were used ineffectively, their actions hampered by inadequate coordination and the absence of the technological parity that radar might have provided. The human cost of this technological revolution extended beyond the sailors who died in the explosions and fires. Thousands of Japanese soldiers stranded on isolated islands throughout the Pacific starved slowly as supply runs became impossible. Without the Tokyo Express to deliver food, ammunition, and reinforcements, these garrisons were left to fight until they died or surrendered. The radar advantage that allowed American destroyers to dominate night waters translated into strategic control of entire island chains, condemning Japanese forces to isolation and eventual defeat. American destroyer crews recognized their technological advantage, but also understood the courage of their opponents. The Japanese fought desperately, even when they knew they were at a disadvantage. Ships continued engaging even after taking mortal damage. Crews refused rescue after their vessels sank, preferring death to capture. The battles weren't won because Japanese sailors lacked skill or determination. They were won because one side possessed technology that made traditional skills irrelevant in the new warfare environment. The lessons learned in the Solomons shaped American naval doctrine for decades after the war. The Combat Information Center concept, developed from improvised procedures used aboard ships like USS Washington and Burke's destroyers, became standard in all subsequent warship designs. The CIC centralized radar displays, plotting tables, and communication systems in a dedicated space where trained personnel maintained situational awareness for the commanding officer. Modern warships still use this organizational structure, though the electronics have evolved dramatically. Training programs for radar operators became extensive and standardized. Before the Solomons campaign, radar training was minimal and inconsistent. After Cape Street, George, the Navy established schools teaching operators how to interpret returns, track multiple targets, maintain plots, and communicate effectively with weapons stations. Officers received training in commanding using radar data as their primary information source rather than a backup to visual systems. Tactical doctrine evolved to assume that radar would be available and functional in all major engagements. Formations were designed around radar coverage patterns. Ships with superior systems were positioned where they could track the most contacts. Task force commanders were required to use ships with the best radar as flagships, regardless of which vessel was most powerful otherwise. This represented complete inversion of traditional doctrine that placed the most heavily armed ship at the formation's center. The technological revolution extended beyond radar alone. American forces integrated radar with improved fire control computers, better torpedoes, and superior communications systems. The Mark 8 Rangekeeper, a mechanical, analog computer weighing several tons, calculated firing solutions continuously based on radar data. American destroyers could launch coordinated attacks using information shared by radio between ships. Multiple vessels could engage the same target simultaneously, concentrating firepower in ways that Japanese forces operating without comparable equipment couldn't match. Japanese attempts to counter American radar advantages proved futile. They developed radar warning receivers that could detect when they were being tracked by American radar. But these systems only confirmed what Japanese crews already knew. They were being watched by an enemy they couldn't see. Some Japanese ships attempted to use chaff. Metallic strips dropped to create false radar returns, but the countermeasure proved ineffective against skilled American radar operators who could distinguish genuine contacts from interference. The broader strategic impact of radar superiority contributed to Allied victory in the Pacific War. American forces could conduct operations at night with confidence that they possessed tactical advantages over any Japanese force they encountered. Amphibious landings could be protected by destroyers that would detect and engage any approaching enemy ships before they reached the invasion beaches. Supply convoys could be escorted through waters where Japanese submarines and surface raiders operated, with radar providing early warning of threats. The transformation happened remarkably quickly. In November of 1942, American forces were barely holding their own in night battles against the Japanese. By November of 1943, Japanese ships avoided night engagements unless they had overwhelming numerical superiority. The technological advantage had shifted from theoretical capability to practical dominance in just 12 months, the time required for enough American ships to receive radar equipment and for commanders to develop effective doctrine for exploiting it. Individual Japanese commanders recognized what was happening and tried to warn their superiors. Captain Hara, who survived the war to write extensively about his experiences, repeatedly emphasized in reports that Japanese destroyers couldn't compete against radar-equipped American forces. His warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon, partly because Japan lacked the industrial capacity to close the technology gap, even when naval leadership understood its significance. The final accounting of the destroyer war in the Pacific reveals the magnitude of Japanese losses. Of 129 destroyers that Japan possessed at the start of the war, 134 were sunk by war's end, the total exceeding the starting number because additional destroyers were completed during the conflict. American submarines accounted for the largest number of kills, but surface actions contributed significantly, particularly during the Solomons campaign, when radar advantages proved decisive in multiple engagements. American destroyer losses were comparatively modest despite aggressive operations throughout the Pacific. The United States lost 71 destroyers to all causes during the war, and many of those were to kamikaze attacks in 1945 rather than surface engagements. The disparity reflected not just numerical superiority, but technological advantages that allowed American destroyers to fight effectively in conditions where Japanese forces operated at severe disadvantage. The human stories behind these statistics reveal the personal cost of technological change. Japanese destroyer crews who survived battles they lost described the psychological trauma of fighting enemies they couldn't see. American sailors spoke of the guilt they sometimes felt, destroying ships that never had a chance to fight back effectively. Commanders on both sides recognized that they were witnessing a transformation in warfare where traditional skills and courage were becoming less important than electronic capability and industrial capacity. Admiral Willis Lee, whose use of radar at Guadalcanal had demonstrated its decisive potential, never lived to see the war's end. He died of a heart attack on August 25, 1945, 10 days after Japan surrendered. The stress of commanding battleship forces through 3 years of constant combat operations had taken its toll. Lee was 57 years old, buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His grave marker mentions his 7 Olympic medals, but says nothing about how he proved radar could revolutionize warfare. Commander Arleigh Burke survived the war and went on to become Chief of Naval Operations, serving an unprecedented 3 terms from 1955 to 1961. Burke's career embodied the transformation in naval warfare that radar had enabled. He had proven, at Cape Street, George, that destroyers could function as independent offensive weapons when equipped with electronics that provided tactical advantages over traditionally superior forces. His leadership during the Solomons campaign established principles that guided American destroyer operations for decades. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, whose victory at Vella Gulf had first demonstrated radar's decisive advantage in destroyer combat, continued serving with distinction throughout the war. He commanded cruisers during later Pacific operations and retired as a rear admiral. His careful planning and execution at Vella Gulf became a case study in how to exploit technological advantages through sound tactics and aggressive action. The destroyers that fought these battles had varied fates. USS Charles Osborne, Burke's flagship at Cape Street, George, survived the war and was decommissioned in 1946. USS Dunlap, Moosbrugger's flagship at Vella Gulf, served throughout the Pacific campaign and was scrapped in 1947. These ships represented the first generation of American destroyers to fully integrate radar into their combat systems, proving that the technology could be decisive when properly employed. The broader lesson from the destroyer battles of 1943 extended beyond specific technological advantages. The engagements demonstrated that warfare was becoming increasingly dependent on industrial capacity and scientific capability. Nations that could develop and deploy superior technology faster than their opponents would gain decisive advantages that traditional military virtues couldn't overcome. This pattern would repeat in subsequent conflicts throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. For the Japanese, the radar gap represented more than tactical disadvantage. It symbolized the broader industrial and scientific deficiencies that doomed their war effort. Japan had entered the conflict assuming that superior training, better tactics, and warrior spirit could compensate for material inferiority. The reality proved otherwise. American industrial capacity produced weapons and equipment in quantities Japan couldn't match. American scientific establishment developed technologies that gave tactical advantages Japan couldn't counter. The destroyer battles demonstrated these realities in stark terms. The night of August 6, 1943, marked the beginning of the end for Japanese destroyer supremacy. The psychological impact of Vella Gulf rippled through the Japanese Navy, forcing commanders to confront uncomfortable truths about technological inferiority they couldn't remedy. The confirmation at Cape Street, George 3 months later sealed the transformation. Japanese destroyers would continue fighting throughout the remaining months of the war, but they would never again achieve the victories that had characterized their operations in 1942. The Americans had learned that technology properly integrated with tactics could overcome numerically equal or even superior forces. The lesson wasn't that radar alone guaranteed victory. It was that innovation succeeded when leaders understood new capabilities deeply enough to develop doctrine that exploited them completely. Moosbrugger and Burke had studied how radar could change destroyer combat. They had trained their crews to fight using electronics as the primary sensor. They had developed tactics that maximized radar advantages while minimizing risks. When the battles came, they executed plans that achieved devastating success. The transformation from visual combat to electronic warfare continued accelerating after World War II. Modern warships carry radar systems that would seem magical to the sailors who fought at Vella Gulf and Cape Street, George. the basic principle remains unchanged. Victory goes to forces that can see farther, track more accurately, and respond faster than their opponents. The electronics have evolved from vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits, microprocessors. But the fundamental advantage of knowing where the enemy is while remaining undetected yourself remains as decisive today as it was in 1943. The memorial services Burke's crews requested after Cape St. George reflected understanding that they had witnessed something profound. They had participated in battles where technology provided advantages that felt almost unfair. Japanese ships were sunk by enemies they never saw. Japanese sailors died fighting battles they couldn't win regardless of their skill or courage. The American crews were grateful for their technological superiority, while also recognizing that war's outcome was being determined by industrial capacity and scientific innovation rather than traditional military virtues. The final paradox of the destroyer war in the Pacific was that Japanese forces possessed excellent equipment in many areas. Their torpedoes remained superior throughout the war. Their optical instruments were outstanding. Their ship designs were generally competitive with American equivalents. But they lacked the one technology that had become decisive in night combat, and that single deficiency proved catastrophic. Radar transformed naval warfare more completely than any previous innovation, and Japan entered that transformation years behind its opponents. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.